So we're going to go ahead and start. Thanks everyone for your patience. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, everyone. We are the Center for Economic and Policy Research, which is a Washington, D.C. based think tank. We work on producing economic research on the most important topics that affect people's lives to contribute to the public debate, working on issues like Social Security, healthcare, the national budget, and internationally on the global economy, the International Monetary Fund, and Latin America policy. We are very happy to be here today to present CEPR's latest scorecard on development, looking at closing the gap, and the main question of has the decades-long growth failure finally ended? I'd first of all like to thank SEIU for having us here in the space, and particularly our events team who worked very hard on putting this together, particularly Sarah and Greg and Dan Beaton who came down from Pittsburgh. CEPR's latest scorecard on development looks at data from 191 countries on economic growth and social indicators over the last 50 years to see whether the world's countries have emerged from the long period of reduced economic and social progress that has characterized the post-1980 years. It is updated with the latest data from the just released IMF World Economic Outlook database. And we are very excited to have here today with us Jomo, who has come all the way down from New York to be here obviously for the IMF World Bank meetings and for our wonderful event. Jomo K.S. has been Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UN-DESA, since 2005, and Honorary Research Coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development since 2006. In 2007, he was awarded the Wassily Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. Jomo has authored or edited over 100 books and translated 12 volumes, besides writing many academic papers and articles for the media. Jomo was professor in the Applied Economics Department, the Faculty of Economics and Administration at the University of Malaya until November 2004, is founder-director of the Institute for Social Analysis and founder-chair of IDEAS, the International Development Economics Associates, where he now serves on the advisory panel. During 2008 and 2009, he served as a member of the Stiglitz Commission of Experts of the President of the United Nations General Assembly on reforms of the international monetary and financial system. And he will be sharing his comments through all of these extensive experience on a paper which Mark Weisbrot will be presenting. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mark Weisbrot, who is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, and he's written numerous papers on economic policy, Latin America, and international economic policy. He's also the co-author with D. Baker of Social Security, The Phony Crisis, which is, I think, as relevant today as it was when it was published in 2000. He's also co-authored 2 previous scorecard papers in 2000 and 2005 that have tracked global development trends for the last 50 years. So I'm going to go ahead and give the floor to Mark to present the paper, and then we'll have Jomo also give his comments and perspective on what's happening with global development in the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. We kind of put this together at the last minute because we thought that people might want to have some questions about the paper or answer them, and I want to thank everyone that Deborah just thanked, and also my co-author, Rebecca Ray, who suffered through this for quite a long time, and did a great job, I think. So I want to start with just the idea of this. As Deborah mentioned, we've done this now for 10 years, and it's, we first started looking at this because there was a huge slowdown in economic growth from 1980 to 2000, and it went largely unnoticed in the media, and I would say mostly in the economic profession as well, although a lot more economists would know about it than you would find journalists or people who write about the economy. And just to, I know that growth is not everything, and of course in the last few years, fortunately, the environmental constraints have become a much bigger issue, as they should be. But I want to start out just by giving a little idea of what difference that growth makes. This is a comparison between Brazil and South Korea. And if you can see the graph, and I'm not going to use all the graphs in the paper because there's too many, but I just want to use a few of them at least. And you can see Brazil is the light blue and South Korea is the dark blue line. And Brazil starts out much less poor than South Korea in 1960 with almost twice the per capita income. And they both grow at a similar pace for the first 20 years. And of course, this was a large increase in income for both of them, tripling in South Korea and doubling in Brazil, and one doubling in Brazil. And Brazil ends up, in 1980 with a still much higher standard of living. And then something happened. There was a world recession, and Brazil's growth rate never really recovered from it, and South Korea's did. And so then you see 30 years later, if you look at the two graphs, South Korea has basically European living standards with over $28,000. This is just per capita GDP. It's the simplest measure. And Brazil is there with 10,647. And so how much difference does this make? Well, in terms of poverty, you have a much higher poverty rate in Brazil. You have infant mortality is about 4 times the rate, about 17.3 in Brazil versus 4.5 for South Korea. The poverty rate, if you look at Brazil, you have 42 million people, or 22% of the population, below the $3 a day poverty line. 12.7% below $2 a day. In South Korea, have almost hardly anybody below the $2 a day poverty line. So you really have a huge difference in living standards, and this is a result of economic policy, I would argue. Now, just if you think about this too, I mean, what would the rest of Latin America look like if Brazil was, it would be 2/3 at least, or 70% the size of the U.S. economy, and it would be huge. So even the smaller countries that maybe didn't adopt the right policy, they would still have been pulled up enormously just from one country having continued the kind of pro-development policies. And I want to emphasize this because obviously, they wouldn't necessarily follow the same strategy as South Korea. Maybe there wasn't room in the world for the same, exports, for example. But there was some strategy that they could have done that would have enabled them to have this kind of growth. And so this is just, I think, a way of demonstrating what the slowdown in growth meant, what it means for the vast majority of low and middle income countries to have this huge fall off in growth. And you can see it also for Latin America and the Caribbean. This is just a graph of per capita GDP growth. The first bar is 1960 and 1980. And you can see it's 3.3% average annual growth. Cumulatively is 91% during this period. And then the next 20 years, you have cumulative growth of less than 6%, or 0.3% annually. And then you'll see the rebound. We're going to talk about that. That's the big question, And you can see in Latin America, as a region, you don't have a rebound anywhere near to the prior rates of growth. And there's no reason, by the way, this is not a diminishing returns phenomenon. You can see with South Korea, they grew even faster after they had reached the level that they reached by 1980. So now what we did in this paper is we're not making the same comparison that I made in these first two graphs. Instead, because there is diminishing returns, not only there are diminishing returns, I should say, not only in growth, that is, we don't expect high-income countries to grow as fast as lower and middle-income countries, and you also have diminishing returns for life expectancy. It's going to be easier to go from a life expectancy of 45 to 60 than it is to go, say, from 70 to 75. So what we did is we divided all the countries into quintiles, and so we're not, for the rest of the graphs, we're not comparing the same countries over time. We're comparing every country that started out in 1960 with a certain level of income or a certain life expectancy, with every country that started out in 1980 with that level of income, that level of life expectancy or mortality, and the same for 2000. And the idea here is that there's no reason you shouldn't see the same improvement. I would actually argue you should see better improvement. And you'll see when we get to the upper, when you look at the upper quintiles, you do see better improvement in the later decades for countries that start out at a certain life expectancy, for example, which is what you would expect to happen because they're taking advantage of better technology and medicine and knowledge. And that should be true for everything. And if it's not true, then it's because something went wrong, in my opinion. And that's why I emphasize that this is a policy. These are policy failures we're looking at when we see this long period of failure. And I have to emphasize, like this one, for example, we work a lot on Latin America, and we work with the media. For the last 20 years, I've been trying to get reporters to write about this because it's kind of striking. And in fact, it's more than striking. I mean, you've had elections in Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela and Uruguay and Paraguay and Bolivia and Ecuador and other countries where this was really the issue. I mean, 20 years of failure. And then in the last decade, you had all these left-of-center governments elected because of this unprecedented long-term economic failure in Latin America. And yet, you can't really find, I mean, if you do a Nexus search, you'll find maybe 20 articles, and they're all just mentioning us, basically, a quote from us, and that's it for the last they had at least 15 years to write about this, and now it's over. So to me, the question is, are they going to write about the rebound? I don't know how they could do that, because what's it a rebound from if they never reported the fall off in the first place? But okay, it's an interesting. We can just talk about it in the discussion if you want. But I think it's an interesting phenomenon. I think it's partly because there's a lack of general understanding of what economic growth is and how it relates to living standards. I think that's the basic problem. Okay, so this is the world divided, the 191 countries divided into quintiles. And you can see this kind of V-shaped pattern because you have the fall off in growth. So, the bottom quintiles, the poorest countries, they're starting out in each period with, so there's 3 periods, right? The bar on the left for all of these will be the 1960 to 1980. The middle one is 1980 to 2000. And then the last one is 2000 to 2010, except for the social indicators. Some of those will end at like 2008 or so, because we don't have the 2010 data. And you can see a very clear pattern for the bottom 4 quintiles. You see a much lower rate of growth in the middle period, and a rebound to really the rate of growth in 1960 to 80 that took place over the last decade. So something really happened, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. You're going to cut me off when I go on too long. Okay. So now in each of these papers that we've done, the issue comes up, well, what is the effect of it? And there's a pretty strong correlation between growth and social indicators. And that's why, you saw this comparison between Brazil and South Korea. They took 2 different paths economically, and they ended up with 2 different kind of countries in terms of social indicators, poverty, life expectancy, mortality. So this is just, I'm not going to go through all these, but we look at how the data responded here to the changes. So if you look at life expectancy, you can see the same pattern in the worst off quintile, 31 to 48 years life expectancy. On the vertical axis, what you have for the 3 periods is the rate of progress. So, for example, for the lowest quintile, lowest quintile from 1960 to 1980, you have life expectancy improving at 0.46, or about a half, adding about a half year of life expectancy for every year that goes by during the 2 decades. Then that drops off, and then it recovers some in the last 10 years. Now notice the second quintile, you don't have that recovery. And you have the big drop off, but you don't have the recovery. And that's because, and these are still mostly poor countries, that's mainly because of the HIV/AIDS crisis, where it's showing up overwhelmingly in the last decade. And that's there's a number of countries like South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, that had just huge rates of infection that are infecting us, but a number of other countries as well, where you don't have this recovery. The next quintile, you do see a little bit of, you do see more of the V-shaped pattern, and you don't see it in the higher quintiles. And that, as I said, is what you would normally expect. And that's why I want to emphasize, by the way, the HIV/AIDS crisis is not an completely exogenous variable here. You had, if this were properly treated, these numbers would look a lot different. You had this long struggle even to get the life-saving antiretroviral medicines, and you still don't have treatment for most people. And so that is, that's a health policy failure as well. We look at male and female life expectancy. It's similar, but there's a different pattern. Female life expectancy, you can see in the second quintile especially, is a lot worse. And that's because of the differential impact of the AIDS crisis. A lot higher rates of infection for women, especially in Africa and the hardest hit countries. Mortality goes the other way, because improvement is measured in a reduction of mortality. So that's why these graphs go the other way. And you can see for the second and third quintiles, you do have again the pattern that reflects economic growth, but you don't have it in the first quintile. And again, that's because of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And you see a difference in female adult mortality. It's particularly striking in the bottom quintile, where it actually worsens in the last decade. Again, this is HIV/AIDS crisis. So if you look at child mortality, you do see this V-shaped and a very strong recovery in the last decade. That is, the improvement picks up again. The same is true for infant mortality in the bottom 3 quintiles. And you see the same thing in education for the middle 3 quintiles. This is just measuring public spending on education as a percent of GDP. And so you see again, it's reflecting the pattern of economic growth for the middle 3 quintiles. And the same is true for primary school enrollment. In this case, it's the bottom 3 quintiles. And secondary school enrollment, again, the bottom 3 quintiles show this pattern as well. And you don't really see much pattern in terms of the tertiary or the literacy. Those are the other indicators. So now I want to talk a little bit in the remaining 6 or 7 minutes about what this means. First of all, the question is, why did this happen in the last decade? What were the reasons for this long-term slowdown actually ending for the last decade, and the recovery that you saw? And I think there are several factors at work. First of all, there were a whole set of policies. I should have mentioned this maybe at the beginning. There are a whole set of policy reforms that took place, sometimes starting a little bit before the decade of the 1980, decades of 1980 to 2000, but during those 2 decades, which are commonly referred to as neoliberal. And these include tighter fiscal and monetary policy, sometimes pro-cyclical, as we're witnessing today in the Eurozone, Southern Europe, for example. You had the abandoning of any kind of development strategies, industrialization strategies in most low and middle income countries. You had massive privatizations. You had a large opening up to international trade and capital flows, deregulation of capital flows, and a large reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. So these were the main kind of neoliberal reforms that took place during this period. And, perhaps that's why nobody wants to look at this long term, because the standard view is that these were successful. And if you look at the actual growth performance, it's hard to make the case that these were successful. There were some attempts by the World Bank to do that, but I won't go into them. And even their own evaluations show that these studies were not really up to par. What happened in the last decade? I would say that some of these policies were reversed. You had the collapse of the fixed exchange rate policies in Argentina and Brazil and Russia that collapsed in the 90s, and a number of policies associated with that. And these countries switched to better policies. And in some cases, the policies had less impact than they had prior. You had the big collapses in the former Soviet states and Eastern Europe, you had a very badly, terribly, I would say, managed transition from planned economies, and that eventually recovered. If you have bad policies, you will eventually see a recovery. I think another big factor would be the decline of the power of the IMF during this decade. And that was huge. I think that's a very important thing, because the IMF was the main enforcer or promoter of neoliberal policies, very often pro-cyclical policies. And they had a lot of power. They had kind of a creditors cartel in the 1960 to 1980 period. That pretty much collapsed in the last decade. If you look at IMF lending, in 2003 worldwide it was 120 billion. 4 years later it was down to something like 20 billion, and it was basically just a couple of countries, Turkey and Pakistan. And then it's recovered, since the economic crisis. It's now about 52 billion, but there's nowhere near the influence of the IMF in these countries that it had. All of Latin America, almost all of Latin America is outside of IMF influence, even the ones that have credit lines. There's 11 countries that still have agreements, and there's maybe $1 billion as compared to 50 billion just a few years ago. But it's nowhere near even the influence that you would have with $1 billion of lending. And the same is true for the middle income countries in Asia and Russia. So the main avenue by which these neoliberal policies, and again I have to emphasize often pro-cyclical policies, were implemented, that is no longer really there anymore, and I think that's a really big thing as well. You also had an increasing weight in the world economy of countries that don't have neoliberal policy, most strikingly China, which is basically an economy that is run by the state. The major industrial enterprises are run by the state. The biggest banks are run by the state. It's definitely not a neoliberal story. And they've multiplied their GDP 17-fold in the last 30 years in real terms, and they are now the second largest economy in the world, and bigger than what you see by the exchange rate the exchange rate conversion that's commonly reported at 5 trillion. It's probably closer. It's 10 by the purchasing power parity that's now being used, but that was reduced a few years ago. I would say it's pretty close to the United States if you had a good purchasing power parity measure. So the size of China changes everything because this is a country that's committed to very rapid growth and has done that even through the world recession. And that changes a lot of things because, for instance, it affects commodity prices. That's the main thing, I think, that doubled the overall growth rate of Africa over the last decade. If you compare it to the prior 20 years, that's driven a lot by the increase in commodity prices. So that's another thing that changes the story. So the question is, okay, so these are some big changes that took place in the last decade. Now, you also had the world recession that took a big bite out of the decade, but you saw that, still it did, relatively well. You have a recovery now where the low middle income countries, or what the IMF category, I think they call it emerging and developing countries, is growing at 6.5% now, and the rich countries are recovering at 2.5%. Now again, you would expect slower growth, but you have now the ironic situation that it's really kind of the high income countries that are most constrained by neoliberal policy, even though they don't have to listen to the IMF except in, Portugal and Greece and Ireland and Spain, the countries that are really listening to the European Commission. And I guess to be accurate, I should say, the European authorities, includes the European Central Bank. When I say the IMF, I really don't mean that the IMF per se as an institution, because it really is run by the directors from the United States and Europe. And I guess on top of the United States director is Goldman Sachs. And so you have various influences, and that's why you don't see as much change there as perhaps a lot of the people in the research department might want to see. But nonetheless, the big change that you had, and you can remember we had these discussions 15 years ago when we're fighting to try and reform the IMF, and what's going to happen. And I think that those of us who said what's going to happen is the IMF will reform very, very slowly, but the big change is going to come from fewer countries having to listen to them. And that is what happened over the last 15 years. So is this a permanent change? And can we expect it going forward? I think that some of it, yes. Some of it because of the change in the world economy. And the changes to power relations as well. I mean, you look at the BRICS countries just yesterday came out with a statement saying, we're not going to go for this deal in the WTO that they offered us back in 2008. Well, they wouldn't go for the whole WTO that was offered in 1995. If it were offered today, it would never pass. It wouldn't pass the parliaments and congresses in the world. So the world changes, and these countries, the options increase, the choices increase, the policy choices increase. And so this is progress that's going to continue. The thing, I think the biggest weight right now that's going to, that is the biggest threat is probably the high income countries themselves. They're, as I said, they're a reduced share of the economy. They're about 56% of the world economy on a purchasing power parity basis. Now that's down from 68% 30 years ago. That's a sizable change, but nonetheless, that's still big. And if the United States, were to go with the Ryan plan, okay, they're not going to, but the point is, you see some compromises there. There is a risk that the U.S. and Europe, for example, and even now Japan, could pull the world economy down some in the coming year. And I would say that's the biggest risk. But on the other hand, the low and middle income countries and the developing countries as a group, I think, have to some extent, again, especially China. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'll just take one more minute. I want to mention India too, because China and India are the big, that's most of the developing world. Not in our methodology, because we count each country the same, because we're looking at policy, so we're looking at all countries count the same way. But India, too, I would say, is an example of a country that's just now reaching 2003 to 2008. They grew about 9% annually. That is huge. It's never happened before in that country. And that, I think, is probably a permanent change. I mean, they're going to have high rates of growth. Their savings rate increased enormously, and so they have the capacity to do that. It's quite possible. And that, I would argue, is also, in good part, a result of moving away from certain neoliberal policies, most importantly, overly tight monetary policy and an overvalued exchange rate, which was another one of the neoliberal policies, which I actually didn't mention, the independence of the central banks and that whole effect that had on the slowdown. So, looking forward, I would say that a lot of this change will continue. You will see more progress going forward. The biggest risk in the intermediate run being that the high-income countries themselves have these kind of pro-cyclical, rather, I would say, kind of perverse policies from the standpoint of economic growth. Okay, and I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
So now we'll be hearing from Jomo, and I already did your introduction, so go right ahead. Thank you. Don't forget to hit that.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this launch of this scorecard. I want to congratulate the CEPR and Mark particularly for keeping up this effort over the last decade. I do think it is very important to have this type of scorecard, but in a sense the ambition of the project is huge. I would strongly urge you to tell the different stories almost independently, because there is so much packed into this paper and in the presentation. Many of the graphs, for example, which Mark presented, are not in the scorecard as disseminated this morning. And so it is really a very, very rich paper, and I would strongly recommend that everybody takes a close look at it and that CEPR and Mark elaborate on it and make available many of the graphs which are not in the paper as currently disseminated. It's also important and useful to focus on these stories, on the separate stories, for a number of other pragmatic reasons. It's very difficult from a journalistic point of view to cover all these seemingly disparate stories and try to put them together. But there are also many separate debates, in a sense, distinct debates which need to be addressed, and addressed in the fashion which you do it. In other words, to bring in the growth story and connect it with what's happening in education, what's happening in health, and so on and so forth. There is a great deal of concern, for example, about questions of health and education for various reasons. And the emphasis given to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and so on and so forth, has put a great deal of attention, drawn a great deal of attention to this. But it also raises certain problems, because many of those discussions are uninformed by the perspective which you are bringing up. And that's why I think it is important to engage with those debates, but to bring in the kind of perspective which you offer. Very importantly also in this context, because there's a tendency to look at the social almost as distinct. And so the reforms about education, how to improve the education systems and how to improve health systems and so on and so forth, are often not connected with the growth story and the implications of the growth story for fiscal capacity, for example. And it's for that reason that I think that it is important to do all this, to connect all this. Now, you make the point, which is very important for those folks who are very well-meaning, that growth is actually good for development. Okay? It might seem a very obvious kind of a point, but it needs to be restated, because you see, for example, a great deal of discussion going on about education or about health, which is uninformed, which takes, which makes recommendations regardless of fiscal capacity. And this, I think, is very important, because ultimately, if governments do not have the fiscal capacity to sustain the social spending, for example, you are simply not going to have those kinds of programs being sustainable. You might last as long as some donor finances it, but the moment the donor cuts the aid budget or whatever, or decides to go on to the latest fashion of the day, that's the end of the story. Now, the connection between growth and distribution is done, and I think that is done quite nicely to look at quintiles and the effects, different effects of quintiles. But as you all know, there are many other debates about distribution, which are useful to bring to this. And Branko Milanovic, for example, has recently published his book on distribution. And I think it would be interesting to get some interaction between these different kinds of discourses. One issue which does not come up, and because you're already covering so much here, I will not suggest overloading this particular report. But one thing which I do hope is much more is done with is what is called the functional distribution of income. Distribution of income among, between capital and labor and so on and so forth is kind of a traditional thing, but sort of broken down by sector. And here, of course, we will see a significant part of income accruing, for example, to the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. And if, in some countries, you can go down even further and get a sense of who's been making all the money in the last decade, for example, which will be a very important thing to audit. And so I think in that fashion, you can actually change the debate on inequality in a very important and useful way. The emphasis which you give to life expectancy, I think, is extremely important. Many people don't quite realize that when male life expectancy in Russia dropped during the early Yeltsin years by 6 years, that was the most phenomenal drop in the entire modern period since the time of the Industrial Revolution. A 6-year drop, I mean, outside of wartime, due to, for health reasons. That's an incredible drop. And many of the attempts to try to explain it away in terms of an increase in Russian male alcoholism and so on and so forth simply do not bite, because everybody knows that there was a lot of alcoholism even before that, and so on and so forth. So, I think these are stories, and Larry King, not the CNN Larry King, but Larry King at Cambridge University, for example, has shown the connections between the kinds of policies which you have been correctly criticizing, and especially on privatization and the relationship to male life expectancy. And it is incredible how the data points were selected. He had data points for every year, and the data points were selected for every 5 years by the economist in presenting the same data, but on a 5-year basis, to reduce the impact in terms of the life expectancy. So it's so you can see how as the 19th century British Prime Minister said, there are statistics, and damn lies, or statistics, some variant of that. So let me move to a second issue after making those preliminary comments. I do very much appreciate what you have done with periodization, but I would actually encourage being a bit more flexible with periodization. Of course, we can't be completely flexible about many of these things because it takes a lot of time, but I do think that it's useful to look at the 1970s as a period of transition, as the end of what some economists like to call the Keynesian golden age, and as a period when you had the beginnings of divergence between the rich countries and the poor countries. Because for those of you who are familiar with it, this period was characterized in the West, and I say the West deliberately excluding Japan, because Japan was not part of this story. In the West, this was a period of what was called stagflation, where you had a combination of inflation and very low economic growth, or sometimes negative growth, And this became the basis for attacking and dismantling Keynesian economics. Now, this is not unimportant because there was a problem of stagflation, and one needs to begin to explain it because the simple-minded version of Keynesianism was that there's a trade-off between growth and inflation. You simply have to choose between them. Now, how did this stagflation happen, and how do we understand it, and what are the lessons we learned from it? And then related to that, the whole question of divergence. So you had stagflation in the West, in the rich countries in the West, but you had rapid growth in Latin America, you had rapid growth in parts of Asia, and initially you had rapid growth in Africa as well, but then Africa was hit by a number of factors, including the oil shock and so on, and growth began to decline significantly in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, why do I think this is important to distinguish? Because it is quite possible we are entering an era now of a similar era, an era where, for various reasons, the rich countries have resigned themselves to low growth, ostensibly because, as James Carville famously said, he would like to come back as the bond market, and with good reason, because everybody bows down to the altar of the bond market, and it appears that it is the bond markets which are determining that sovereign debt matters in particular ways, and the pressure in Europe, which has been accepted in Europe, but also in Japan, and also under the current government in Canada, to cut back to cut or not to embark on any kind of recovery measures is justified in terms of the effect of sovereign debt and so on and so forth. Now, in this country as well, that part of the debate is over that. The Obama administration is still probably the only country among the rich countries, or at least among the large rich countries, which is still committed to some kind of reflationary or recovery measures. So although you have been quite correctly and understandably critical of many of the policies which have been associated with the current administration, one looking at the international situation today, it is the US alone which is the dissenter among the G7 economies, and this is not without significance. So if you had, and you do explain why you don't look at the 1950s, but it might be worthwhile to contrast the 1950s and 60s, see the 70s as a transitional decade in a sense, the 80s, 90s as another chunk, and then the current period as another period, and the period beginning with basically with the recovery from the so-called Great Recession as a period which may well mimic at least some features of the second half of the 1970s. Since you are already working with all this data, it might be useful to draw some lessons which I think the world can learn a great deal from in looking at this, because as you correctly point out, very few people actually look at these kinds of issues, and it is very important. You correctly make mention of what you term, and many people term neoliberalism, and the impact of economic liberalization. And there is a hint also of what is popularly referred to as globalization. Now that globalization, in the last couple of years, you don't find the kind of enthusiasm for globalization which you've heard of over the last two and a half decades or 3 decades. It might be important to sort of revisit some of those issues. And I think there is still the presumption that globalization has been good for developing countries. I'd just like to suggest that it might be worthwhile, for example, on trade integration as one aspect of globalization, to recognize that in the course of the 20th century, commodity terms of trade actually declined. This is something which has been established 60 years ago by Singer and Prebisch, but has been subsequently shown to be true for the second half of the 20th century as well. But it is that which has changed in the last decade. Commodity prices have gone up, but if we distinguish between agricultural prices and mineral prices, we find that mineral prices have gone up more than agricultural prices. And that the rise in agricultural prices have been due to the usual supply and demand factors, but demand itself has changed for a variety of reasons, consumption patterns changing and so on and so forth, but also this would be one way of looking at the whole biofuels debate and the impact of biofuels, where countries like Brazil and Cuba and others feel very strongly that biofuels are getting a bad rap because of the huge subsidy element in the West, where you have huge subsidies for maize or corn bioethanol in this country, or vegetable oil-based biodiesels in Europe. And so there are a bunch of issues there, and then of course the impact of financialization is now causing a great deal of havoc in commodity price markets, which actually farmers, for example, do not benefit from. But also very importantly, it is acknowledged that it's had a huge impact on food insecurity. During the past, during the 2007-2009 period, it is estimated that over 100 million people became even more undernourished, hungry, basically. Undernourishment is a polite way of saying you're hungry. Over 100 million people, and the World Bank, no great radical critic of food delivery system, has recently estimated that at least 44 million people would have gone hungry with the recent increase in food prices. And we are talking about an increase over 9 months, the last 9 months, and there's no signs of this abating. Now, we also know that as far as trade liberalization is concerned, that for Africa, for example, production capacities were destroyed. Not only was there deindustrialization in much of Africa, and also in Latin America, I would add, but also as a consequence of trade liberalization, even agricultural production, food production, was destroyed. The former president of Madagascar, for example, pointed out that sub-Saharan Africa was transformed from a net food exporter in the 1980s into a net food importer over the past decade. And then, of course, we know that fiscal capacities have been run down with the loss of tariff revenues due to trade liberalization. But we often, there is a popular perception that globalization is essentially about trade. And in fact, what has been significant in the last 3 decades is that financial globalization has actually grown faster than trade globalization, if you will. And this has been despite the fact that at least since the late 90s, there was strong evidence that financial globalization did not contribute to growth and actually exacerbated instability. Okay? And this was done by economists such as Ken Rogoff, economic advisor to John McCain, Senator John McCain for his presidential campaign. It is amazing that policies were pursued despite the fact that there wasn't even an analytical consensus within the profession about these things. I mean, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're wrong. One has to think very, very seriously about how these policies were sustained, despite the fact that there was no analytical evidence, not just among wild-eyed radicals, but even among the mainstream of the profession, that this was actually contributing in any way to growth, or for that matter, stability. Now, we also know, as another very conservative economist recognized many years ago, that capital was flowing uphill. The argument for financial liberalization was that you would have capital flowing from the capital rich to the capital poor countries. That simply did not happen. It flowed from the capital poor to the capital rich, and even from the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And Lucas recognized this long ago. It was called the Lucas paradox. But nonetheless, it was pursued. So the question then becomes, why are such policies pursued despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and actually a consensus, a rare consensus among economists about its consequences? Now, then we also know that the cost of funds did not really decline because of financial deepening and so on and so forth. Also we know that volatility, instability, and fragility are worsened. And in developing countries, very often when you did open up, capital account liberalization resulted in bubbles and busts. It also resulted sometimes when capital was available very cheaply, it resulted in consumption binges, and arguably it resulted in overinvestment. Which leads me to the big problem in the world today. The fact that because there was cheap credit for almost a decade following the dot-com bubble and the efforts of the Fed to sort of try to accelerate recovery by keeping interest rates low. So what has happened as a consequence of that is that you have had cheap credit and you have had overinvestment in many sectors. So right now, there's a great deal of reluctance by the private sector to invest, because most sectors are seen as already overinvested. There's an underutilization of capacity and so on and so forth. So how do you kickstart new private sector investment? This is a major challenge all over the world. And this is where it becomes crucial to have the incentives to motivate investments in new areas, hopefully socially desirable. And this can only come about if there are incentives. In a sense, public investments crowding in, to use the preferred economic term, private investments. And this could be done, for example, with the generation of renewable energy, for example. If this is seen as desirable to replace fossil fuel energy and so on. And this could have been done, for example, in connection with the bailing out of Detroit, and moving to the electric car and so on and so forth. Now, since I'm running out of time, let me just make one point on inequality. Inequality, as you correctly point out in the earlier scorecards as well, has actually been growing in recent decades. In most countries, okay, there are very few exceptions. Brazil is one important exception over the last decade, where you've seen the Gini coefficient come down and so on. But in most countries, including the fast-growing economies, income inequality is actually increased. And we also know that international inequality, well, depending on how you measure it, has actually seemed to decline over time a little bit. And it's largely due to the growth of China and India, okay, because of the weight of China and India and all this. But overall, if you think of inequality overall, and this is Milanovic's point, international differences, international inequality is far greater than national level inequalities, which raises very, very important questions. So you might actually have, as you had in the immediate post-war period during the Golden Age, a decline in world inequality during the forthcoming period, mainly due to low growth in the rich countries and continued high growth in the developing countries. Okay? And it also, the presumption that you needed high growth in rich countries as to absorb the exports from developing countries, that presumption would also be challenged in the current period, which would then lead to new forms of organization, but the pressures of economies of scale suggest that we may well see a greater significance of regionalism. So Mercosur and various other types of arrangements may well become significant. Now, I don't have time to elaborate on questions of the role of government, but I think it is quite correct that you've put a lot of emphasis on the role of government. But I think rather than seeing things in terms of the retreat of the state, I think a changed role of the state is how it should be understood. Because very often the government's role continues to be sometimes strengthened in certain areas. You might have less of a spending role of government, but government role, for example, in strengthening property rights, including foreign intellectual property rights, may actually be increased. And so you might have a significant increase in the commercial branch of the police force, for example, and things like that. Not exactly what you are advocating, but
right.
Suddenly it's not a diminution of the role of the state. Now, finally, I'd just like to say that use this opportunity to say make a few quick points about poverty. The measurement of poverty has always been controversial, and 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, the World Bank came out with its latest poverty figures, and its previous poverty figures suggested there were slightly under 1 billion people who were poor in 2004. When the 2005 figures came out, the number of poor people went up to 1.4. Okay, so you have a 40% increase in the number of poor people because of a different methodology and different measures of poverty, and which raises some very important questions about how poverty is measured. How is it that poverty seems to be going down according to the bank, but the number of hungry people are going up according to the FAO and the USDA? This becomes, and ostensibly, poverty is the line used to measure what it takes to avoid being hungry. There's obviously something seriously wrong there. Also, I think it's very useful to review the poverty magic bullets, which are very popular in this town. I mean, for example, strengthening property rights, okay, by the man hailed by President Clinton as the greatest economist of the 20th century, who wasn't even an economist, Fernando de Soto, or good governance, which was pushed by Professor Kaufman from Chile through the World Bank, or the late Professor Prahalad's favorite was what is it? Well, it's called marketing to the bottom of the pyramid marketing. Okay, that somehow or other, instead of selling shampoo in a large bottle, if you sell it in small sachets, somehow or other it will create a great number of jobs. And don't laugh. This is the and a few other things like that, and of course microcredit. And there's a huge fight going on right now in the world of microcredit, where so under the guise of corporate social responsibility, many of the captains of finance have been going into many developing countries and with very, very usurious loans, and also in those countries, and we find, for example, in southern India, according to a journalist named Sainath, over 220,000 farmers have committed suicide. Of course, there are many factors which have contributed to this. This is over the last dozen years. And there are many factors which have contributed to the suicide, including the cotton price subsidies and so on and so forth. But these are all things which are worth looking at. So you have Professor Yunus, for example, trying to distinguish between socially driven microcredit and other kinds of microcredit which are very commercially and profit-oriented and so on and so forth. So we have a very, very rich, I mean, we really need to look at these magic bullets, and this is really the time to look at those magic bullets in connection with, you know, what are the drivers of these improvements in health and education which you have been able to point out. Because there is a world out there which actually thinks that all these things, and these are very well-meaning people who are working in all these areas, you know. But it is very important, I think, to address these magic bullets because they are so popular. So the last point I would like to make in this connection is that quite correctly, your approach addresses this view that, you know, development is nothing but poverty reduction. You know, poverty reduction is an outcome of development, and there are many factors which contribute to development, and that is, I think, extremely important. So I would once again like to congratulate you on a very useful document, which I hope gets the attention it deserves. But one way of getting that attention may well be to repackage it in smaller reports, which are much more focused and which will be addressed to particular constituencies and open up the debate and inform those debates with the kind of perspective which you're bringing to bear in this scorecard. So congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for your comments and insightful long-term perspective. We'd like to invite if folks have questions from the audience. We do have a few minutes.
I would like
do you want to
just-
respond first? Okay, go
Yeah,
ahead.
there are just a couple things I really wanted to thank Jomo for the comments because it's kind of a nice research agenda. And I think we would like to do some of it. There are a couple things though that we have done, and we do look at the separate country stories, especially in Latin America. We do a lot of regular kind of country papers and updates, and where we look at the impact of policy changes on these indicators. And so we can't do that for the whole world. Our budget is only 1,000th the size of the IMF, but we do that. The other thing that I think, the other point that you raised that we also, I think, have addressed, and most of the others we haven't, but my colleague Dean Baker has written quite a bit, including more than one book, about this idea of the role of the state, and that, in fact, he's fought a kind of never-ending battle with the rest of the progressive community, arguing that in the United States in particular, the right-wing agenda has not been a reduction of state, of the size or power of the state, but merely a shift in its redistributive function. That is, it's in areas like intellectual property, bankruptcy law, and a whole host of other areas. The state power, I think the right has actually wanted and succeeded in increasing the power of the state to redistribute upward. It has deregulated only in the use of market in order to redistribute it away from the majority. And his argument has been, and I think he's right, although very few people seem to want to go along with it, that the progressive community should not accept the narrative to the right of the right that it's which they have accepted, that the progressives want the state and the government and the conservatives want the market, but rather it's what you want the state and the market to do. I mean, we're for competition in the areas of, for example, generic drugs. It's extremely important to healthcare reform. So anyway, I just wanted to respond to those two things, and the other points, of course, we could talk about quite a bit. They're very, very, very useful.